This is Landry.Audio. Listen, like, and subscribe. That means hitting that little bell on YouTube, as far as I know, to stay up to date with the interviews that we're doing. This is kind of my personal series on the guys that I've trained with in mixed martial arts. I've already had the opportunity to do Australian legends like Anthony Parash, Elvis Sinisic, and even Peter Graham, who I knew training with at Larry's gym in Boxingworks. Larry Papadopoulos is a pancrase and shooto practitioner. He's been in the ring with Ken Shamrock, Akiro Gono, competed in ADCC, works with the Sydney Roosters NRL club, which we'll start talking about Grapple Tackle and all that sort of jazz as well. I was a member of his gym in Boxingworks for 4 or 5 years, from I want to say 2009, 2010 up to 2014, while I was living in the CBD, otherwise known as the downtown of Sydney. Again, working with Larry and guys like K1 legend Peter Graham. I distinctly remember a period of time doing mid-morning classes with Larry when MMA was scheduled in the morning, but no one would be there because I'd all be at work. So I got to have a lot of private time with Larry doing sparring sessions and learning a lot about wrestling. One of my favorite memories, I shared it with Larry, was during the UFC came to Australia for the very first time, and we had everyone coming through the gym at that time. Big Nogueira, Wanderlei Silva, Mayhem Miller, Christoph Szynski, Chris Hazeman, whose fight got canceled with Elvis, Shooto Box owner Rafael Cordero, who you might know is training Mike Tyson in his later days now, and even had my favorite fighter of all time, Randy Couture, pop down to say hello, who I believe Larry's very good friends with. And it's been almost a decade since I last spoke with Larry, so I'm kind of almost surprised that you remember me as well. But let's start there, Larry. You've got a hell of a lot of credentials, a lot of black belts. Why don't you run us through, your background and experience?
Not a lot of black belts. Typical story of martial arts. I started judo when I was 10. Started doing Japanese style jiu-jitsu, more like modern jiu-jitsu at 16. Yeah, self-defense kind of stuff. When I finally got to uni, and when I was training at 16, the gym I trained at, or the dojo back then, with my sensei, instructor Vince McCann, we used to have boxers come in, judo guys come in. It was actually quite mixed back then, so I was lucky from 16. I had a very open-minded coach who himself had done some boxing and was quite willing. We had karate guys in there, so we would cross-train from there. But yeah, the core was jiu-jitsu, and the most important thing for the coaches, my early coach, was it was never, you can't go anywhere else. If you want to train somewhere else, go and learn, show us what you learned, or see if it works, etc. When I went to uni, I continued training, did more judo, because New South Wales Uni was a very strong judo uni. So then I actually dislocated my knee at university, second year that I went there. So I had to change tact. Back then it wasn't arthroscopic, it was open surgery. So I got massive 2 scars on my knee because my knee actually went out sideways. Nice. I was told I wouldn't compete again in anything because it was such a complete dislocation, every ligament torn and whatever. So 18 months later, I came back and discovered like wrestling. So just because I had that fear from judo is when it happened. I started doing more wrestling. And was always aware of what was happening, reading the martial arts magazine. And then one of the magazines was by John Will, who used to do the Blitz and used to talk, he was Penjak Silat, whatever. And then wrestling in India, and then suddenly started talking about this Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. So that piqued our interest. When finally there was an opportunity to train with John, doing seminars, did that with John Will. So that was my first introduction to BJJ as such. So at that stage, John himself, I think he was doing his shoot fighter. He was great. He had his own system. I think he was only a blue belt. But the brilliant thing was that he was probably teaching the stuff he learned at that level, which was appropriate to everybody else. And I think that helped us go along. So that was the BJJ, how I got started with BJJ. And luckily enough, I'd wrestled and done judo. So and my jiu-jitsu previous coach, he was really big on groundwork. We do this thing called back-to-back, start back-to-back and wrestle. And he was really big on grappling as well, because the style of jiu-jitsu that I did in Australia, the actual group was called Australian Society of Jiu-Jitsuans, but it traces its history right back to 1906. And in 1906, a Japanese fellow by the name of Ruguro Fukushima came to Australia. and Fukushima had a standing offer, come one, come all, and he'd wrestle them all. They put judo or jiu-jitsu jackets on. He was from Hagiwara's jiu-jitsu school, so he wasn't a Kodokan guy. We've researched him, we've got pictures of him. There are newspaper articles about him, and what he did, he actually challenged a boxer down in Melbourne, a guy called McVie. So he was one of the original mixed martial arts guys. Probably what was happening in Brazil was happening here in Australia, and people don't know. And there are records of the competitions that this guy got in. He in the boxer versus jiu-jitsu guy in Melbourne, Fukushima, it was best out of 3 falls. Got sparked about a minute into the first round, was out cold. They dragged him back to his corner. He's vomiting. He's really bad. And this is the description. You can see this description in the newspapers at the time.
Comes to, and they send him out again.
Mate, got back up. Apparently he did, and it describes he scissor takedown. He used his legs to scissor takedown and ankle locked him. Won the second round. Went back to the corner, was still sick. Going up the third round, did the exact same thing. So McVie, or whatever his name, had small little gloves on, was trying to knock him out. And he just did, Kani Basami, scissor throw, and ankle locked the guy and beat him 2 out of 3. And that's actually recorded in Australian newspapers and stuff like that. And he would take on all comers, boxers, wrestlers. And he used to go in the Shaman boxing troupe, which used to do, all in competitions like that. So that was kind of where my jiu-jitsu came from. They had a very strong wrestling and then cross-training background. So that's probably, I was lucky I started with that jiu-jitsu rather than a lot of other jiu-jitsus, which were, too traditional, which you would never have thought of boxing, wrestling and stuff like that. So I think I was very fortunate. I had that open-mindedness from when I first started, and that helped me later on. That's why you'd probably imagine a lot of jiu-jitsu guys wouldn't have even gone to BJJ saying, it's fighting on the ground, whereas my coach was, go and learn. This sounds great. So anyway, that's a long story. So basically judo, Japanese jiu-jitsu or base Japanese jiu-jitsu, wrestling, boxing, BJJ. My credentials are I'm a 5th degree, though I could have been more in the Japanese style of jiu-jitsu. I've got a shodan or in judo from my coach that I had, Sonny Gucci, and I'm now a 3rd degree BJJ, just as you do in time, through Asej Haddad in Brazil, and they're my only actual credentials. So they're the 3 belts that I do have. I think 3 is enough. Yeah.
So in another interview, then I had heard that you're associated with John Donahue, though.
Yeah. So what happened was when I was fighting. So in 1994, 93. We used to have a gym on on Pitt Street in the city, and the monorail used to go past, and a Japanese guy happened to be looking out the monorail, looking through our windows. We were on the same level, and noticed training, and we must have been, I think at that time we were doing some jiu-jitsu or something, and he got off the monorail, came up and walked in, didn't speak English, probably took some photos, went back to Japan. He was actually a reporter in Japanese martial arts magazine. He said, here we have, and he must have seen back then what our typical class was, do stand-up, do grappling standing like wrestling, and then do groundwork. So we were doing mixed martial arts. And the original article I still have, and he says, kakutogi, which means kind of fighting styles of martial arts in Sydney, Australia. And then the talent scouts from Pancrase saw it and said, wow, look at this. These guys, they were looking for people to fight in Pancrase. So we were training one day, and this guy called Greg Smith and a Japanese guy, Mr. Ozaki, come through the door, introduce themselves. We're talent scouts from Pancrase. We're looking for fighters wishing to go to Japan and compete. And I thought, what a great opportunity. I've always wanted to go to Japan, the home of martial arts, so to speak. And so that was in 93. So in 94, started fighting Pancrase. Unfortunately, Pancrase, I did okay, but not fantastic. But it was no weight class. So you were fighting guys. My first fight with Scott Bizak was about 126 kilos, and I weighed 88 back then. So it was, though I did okay, eventually I cracked a couple of ribs. I never cracked ribs before, and I kind of panicked in the fight. And, didn't know what to do about it. If I'd ever done it before, I probably wouldn't have panicked. And then anyway, I was fighting that, and I switched to shooto. And then when I switched to shooto, like I'd met Cameron Quinn up in Queensland. So I don't know if you ever trained with Cameron. He used to come down.
So
quite frequently.
I'll ask you to pause because there's so much stuff I want to get to in the background before we actually hop into the fighting. But you mentioned Cameron Quinn, where I teach now at a place called Newcastle Karate. Sensei Mark Matthews, who runs it, I think is associated with Cameron Quinn. So I've started to learn more about, traditional karate. And I've still got the original VHS tape of, I think it was Australian Caged Combat, which had Mario and Elvis in it. And I think Cameron Quinn is the ref in that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he was.
That's right. Yeah. So I've still got that on VHS floating around somewhere, which is how I was originally introduced to Elvis, which is how I ended up in Sydney coming to Australia, which is how I ultimately ended up meeting you as well. It's all from a stupid videotape, hey?
Yeah. So anyway, with Cameron, that's how I met John Donohue. So I know it's a long way, but I was fighting in Shooto by that time, and I thought, with John Will, I thought I'd be continuing studying under John, but what happened, because I was fighting pancrase and John had an association with the Machados, John's opinion was that if I was fighting in Japan, it would the guys in Japan would learn the BJJ kind of secrets, and he didn't want me to help them because one day they and the Machados, or so, it was one of those things. And John basically said, "Look, I can't coach you anymore." So instead of continuing with John Will, that's why I eventually found John Donohue through Cameron Quinn. Cameron Quinn said, "Look, this is Aussie guy in LA teaching out of the Inasano Academy," and I happened to be there for my.
So Dan Santo, Bruce Lee, LA, Donohue, this sort of connection, right?
Yeah. So, and the funny thing was, John Donohue was with the Machados. So he was one of Mohegan Machado's main training partners,
Right.
And so it all goes back to the Machados. And my first grade is actually by Mohegan Machado, because John was only a brown belt at the time. And I'd go and train with John Donohue in LA. And then he said, "Look," I asked Hegan if you're a blue belt, and he said, "Yeah, you can be a blue belt." So that's how I got my first grade, actually, officially Hegan. Okay.
Hold on. Explain this to me again. So you're training with John Will, who says, "We can't continue to teach you because we can't give the Japanese BJJ secrets. Go speak to John Donohue, who's also Machado."
John Donohue,
right?
Said, so I stopped training with John Will.
Right. Okay.
And it was quite funny because there was incidences where some of my guys would go to Anthony Lang's. They had seminars with John, and then when he find out it was one of my guys, "Oh, they've got to leave." Look, it was quite strange at the time. I thought it was quite odd of John, but look, he had his reasons for doing stuff. And anyway, so I stopped training with John Wilt, who was the Machado guy. And then a year or a couple of years later, I hook up with John Donohue and I train at the Machados. And I've got stories of training at Machados in LA. And my first grade is by Hegan Machado.
Yeah.
And then when John Donohue moved back to Australia, that's when I started training with John Donohue. And quite honestly, as far as technique and stuff, I cannot comment on John Will because obviously I trained with John very early, and I'm sure he's very, very competent. He's very, very good. The same as Peter Devine. But John Donohue, I found to have good encyclopedic knowledge, and he had a good wrestling base from training with people like Rico Ciparelli, and that's how I met.
That's a name I haven't heard in a while. Those are those sort of UFC 2030s. His name was bandied all around then.
And so, like for me, it was kind of, okay, well, this guy's quite willing to coach me, and he didn't have any issues with me fighting. And that's how I got on with John Donohue. And then, it was kind of, still a lot of respect for John and that, but, we've just gone our own ways. He does his own thing. And since I stopped fighting, I kind of done my own thing too. And I don't like playing politics. That's why if people get really political with me, I kind of disassociate myself because I really don't want to. For me, the best thing that I've heard as far as martial arts and that goes is that if you close your eyes and let me punch you in the face, you tell me
you can't tell what art it is.
Tell me whether I use the boxing technique, taekwondo punch, karate punch. Same as if you close your eyes and I armbar you or sweep you, tell me whether that was Machado Jiu-Jitsu, Gracie Barra. It's all the same.
So I asked Elvis this as well, and it seems to me, because again, I didn't move to Australia until 2004, and I ended up at SPMA, which was Elvis and Anthony at the same time. But it seems to me with a lot of the circle, at least that I know, it seems that the Machados had an imprint here in Australia long before the Gracies, because you mentioned Will and Lang and Donohue, who were all Machado as well.
Absolutely. I think really the birth of BJJ in Australia. I think they explained that Pete Devine and John were together, and they used to travel together and do all the training together. And then they ended up in Brazil, and John followed the Machados back to the States. This is my understanding, but Peter stayed there. And that's why Peter got involved with Carlinhos. And Peter Devine, stayed and trained and got graded there. So, a different level of, a different kind of training and whatever. So, but John came back, and I think John really is the so-called godfather of BJJ in Australia. I believe he started well before all these other groups that came out. And Australia owes a big debt of gratitude to John Will for having done that, for being one of the first pioneers that went out there and did it. Now, regardless of whose school is better and whose style is better, you've got to acknowledge the efforts that guy made and the impression. Like, I mean, if it wasn't for John Will, I wouldn't have been as interested, in BJJ. And then I owe John Donoghue a great debt of gratitude because of the technical stuff, and then the doors he opened to other people. So I've been very fortunate. I think I've trained with the right people at the right time. So.
Yeah. You talk about going through knee surgery and doing judo comparatively to wrestling. As I mentioned, I've done a little bit of both as well, but I don't think a lot of people understand kind of the fundamental differences in the sport. And you would have trained as well judo at a time where you could still attack the legs, which I don't think is part of judo as well anymore. But I remember practicing with that jacket and just getting thrown around, like going airborne comparatively to wrestling. And can you just take us through the differences of what that does to your body, judo comparatively to wrestling, and why you ended up, moving down that path?
I think judo, there's a plus and minus, there's a positive and negative. In judo, there's a heck of a lot more landing on a very hard surface. Tatami, notoriously around the world.
That's one way to say it.
I trained in Ochunamizu in Japan, and the tatami were basically on a concrete base in the basement, and it was just horrible. I remember early days of training, you just get thrown repetitively. Now, I believe it toughened your body up. But one thing I think maybe they're more aware of now, continued impact and landing will create head trauma. Yeah. So, people now are understanding that, getting thrown a lot, and people have been concussed and people have died from head impact. And judo is probably more notorious than that than wrestling. Wrestling, you might break a neck because unfortunately, a lot of the techniques are to land on your head and bridge on your head, but you don't get as much concussive force. I don't think you get as much concussion in wrestling. And wrestling mats are much softer, much softer than judo mats. But I think things are changing a little bit. With the jacket gives you more handles. In wrestling, you've got certain handles: wrist, tricep, bicep,
collar tie,
underhook. So you can use those handles. In judo, you've got the full length of the lapel. You've got parts of the jacket where you can grip where you wouldn't normally grip a human being unless you grab the ounce of flesh. So the amount of throwing technique is much larger than wrestling, as far as I'm concerned. And the amplitude of the throws used to be much higher amplitude in judo, because you wanted that ippon where they said, the whole body. So judo had higher amplitude throws. Wrestling, the big amplitude throws were only ever going to be the suplexes. But wrestling, if you knock a person down, they fall down and get on top. You still got points. You didn't. In wrestling, you knock guys down quite often rather than throw them. Trips and stuff like that. So, judo, it's the impact of landing. There's a lot more concussive force and stuff like that. In wrestling, a lot more twisting and landing. And again, you don't land on your back, you twist and land to your front. It's you've got to do both to understand. And then you've got the differences between Greco and freestyle. So
we'll talk about that in a second, because I recently signed. We're part of the Catch program as well, and Catch seems to be just blasting off through MMA now. So we'll kind of break that up into the stuff. But before we get into that, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is, a lot of people don't understand the issues of when you're growing up of cross training at other gyms. And as I mentioned, I didn't have a problem doing this. So like when with the limited amount of fights that I had, Elvis and Anthony, I'd be over at PCYC to do boxing work with those guys. But the time period that you were growing up with, tell me about the culture of doing martial arts. And I think in BJJ they use the term crianche, which is
traders. I never heard that till later. I think that was maybe one of the reasons why John Will took that tack. But look, I understand if you're starting to train with someone and the coach feels that it's going to be detrimental to you going to another style, you can say, look, you really need to get your base here. That makes sense, and I don't think being able to go to other schools, it wasn't, I showed a real interest and a hunger for knowledge, that my coach said, look, I've got to feed this, and then he allowed me. But, we were already cross-training in the gym.
Yeah.
I think some people don't want you, most people, unfortunately, don't want you cross-training because they don't want to lose the student and go to someone better, or that's not as good. But if someone sincerely feels, look, it's going to be detrimental to you, look, I say, look, stick with me for a little while, get your base here, and then go to those other schools. The same way when we get someone in our boxing, kickboxing, they want to go sparring, it says, look, make sure one of us are with you, because you go there, they're not going to look after you. The coaches, academy fighters. So that's a real concern for a coach with people going to other schools. One of the things I always found very difficult, I've employed a lot of Brazilian coaches to teach at my school, and it's been a constant, and that's why I won't do it anymore, is quite often they
build up their number base and off they go.
And they want to be their own school, and it's just like, dude, it's the wrong thing to do. And they quite often, they don't understand. It's just like if you're a football coach and you're at one team and then you go to the other team, it doesn't mean you got to carry the old team over there. You're a professional coach and act as a professional, getting paid to coach. Build up that team. You don't steal the players and go to the next team. You just go to the next team, or build your own team from scratch. Build that around you, and then you poach players and do whatever. But Criancha, I can understand. I can understand kind of that side of it, but when you come from wrestling, when you train at wrestling, I can tell you, I've got cauliflower ears, and it's funny when you go to a wrestling gym, and I've been spotted in crowds at funny.
I get the same thing. Your legit is right there. They already know that you're legit. I guess almost it's your visa to get into the country.
But you know what's so funny? It's like two dogs sniffing each other's ass. When dogs sniff each other, you guys got cauliflowers. You go and you look at each other's cauliflower ears, and you wrestling or jiu-jitsu, and then you have this.
Yeah. Well, I get asked if I play league a lot, and I go, no, I'm not a league player, but
with wrestling especially, I've been to Bulgaria, Russia, Italy, obviously Greece, and anywhere I go, and if I go to a wrestling club, it's come in, brother, come in and train. Train. There's none of this, which school are you from, whatever. You're a wrestler, you're a brother. You're a brother, and you train, because there's no secrets in wrestling. And the only way I'm going to beat you, even if I know your best technique, if I practice.
It's just grit, effectively, half the time.
Yeah, you got to train. And unfortunately, I think in BJJ back then, it was, these are our techniques, these are secrets. It's like, is there a secret really?
I kind of like that. I might start to use that. Your ears are your credentials.
Well, yeah, I do. And it's like I said, it's like the two dogs sniffing each other's butts. It's so funny that I've looked at someone and you just see this, you go, you look at each other's ears. And like I said, I've been poolside at Vegas, and just by chance, this guy looks at me and I look at him. We've both got cauliflower. Oh, you train? Yeah. What are you wrestling? And it happened to be a jiu-jitsu instructor from LA.
Yeah.
That my friends in Greece trained with.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And then we go, you're so-and-so. Oh, you're Larry. And it's just, Nectarius and Panayotis in Greece. Yeah, we're good friends. And then when I traveled back to LA, it was like, come and train with me. It's
a very small world, isn't it?
Yeah, in the end. And the time for where one school, to stop your student from traveling to other schools, or when people have open mats. Now it's more common to have open mat. Everybody comes from schools, they train together, and you get stronger. And again, when in Australia, I don't think we have the population base to have one club with 30 of the best guys in, like they do in Brazil.
An AKA or something like that, or
And it's the same in all combat sports in Australia. You ask all the good boxers, they're all sparring each other all the time. They help each other. Yeah. But then they might fight each other 6 months down the track. They just stop sparring. And that's what I found in pancrase. When I was living at the gym, we'd be training all together, and then they come up and say, you can't train with him anymore. You're fighting him in a month. So we would train at separate times, and that would happen.
Let's talk about those differences a little bit, because you come from an earlier era. I mean, you're kind of fighting, prior to, the UFC might have been happening, but still a lot of people didn't even really know.
UFC started in 93.
Yeah.
So an oddity, you know.
Do you it's even hard to harken back to a time where you couldn't look it up on the internet. It's like, how did you even find out about this stuff? But how to talk to us about what pancrase is and what shooto is, and the differences organizationally and all that sort of thing.
You go back to the history of all Japan wrestling. So basically, Japan obviously loved their combat sports, and they started pro wrestling. And pro wrestling, you know,
this is hard style. It's
it actually goes right back to one of the big sumo guys. I'll think of his name in a sec. And he said, I want to start professional wrestling, and like Antonio Inoki and guys like that. So there was one guy, I'll think of his name in a sec, and he started pro wrestling in Japan, and there was a lot of people backing it. And from pro wrestling, you had All Japan and New Japan Wrestling and stuff like that. And you had, they all used to go to, it's quite interesting, they were all together and they used to go to Gotch in Tampa, Florida and train.
And we'll talk about catch a little bit later as well, yeah.
Go and train with Gotch, yeah, and they'd come back. And,
I'll enjoy that. I got my little sakudo.
Good. And you ask, most of those guys went and trained with Gotch. It was kind of like a thing. Now, they all used to be part of New Japan Wrestling, and the pancrase guys used to fight there. And then what happened is they went to, you know, the godfathers there, who were there, and said, we want to start our own promotion, but we actually want to do real wrestling, real fights, but pro wrestling, real fights. And
those are called shoots. Is that?
Well, yeah, if you look at traditionally, yeah, you had journeymen, you had shooters, and then you had hookers. Yeah, hookers were the guys that could break everybody. Shooters, the guys that could really fight, and journeymen were the bullshit guys. They wanted shooters and hookers only. So they went to New Japan or whatever it was back then. I think New Japan was the old one, and they sponsored them. So okay, go and train with Gotch, do whatever you want, and tell us how you're going to start this. They went and trained with Gotch, and they asked Gotch, and they said, well, yeah, we want to have real pro wrestling where it's real fights. What can we call it? And he said, look, there was the pancration, you know, so we call it pancrase. And that's where pancrase came from, because Carl Gotch told them to do it. They went back and they started.
Right. So he's the creator of that name, harkening back to
they got it from Gotch
thousands of years ago, effectively. Yeah, right.
So Suzuki and Funaki, they were the two main stars at that time. They were big names, and they got sponsored to start a new promotion. So with money, they were seeded by New Japan. So they started, and they took a lot of the real top fighters. They started these real fights, and that's why they looked for talent from overseas. So if you look at Bus Rutten, you know, like the first fights, he was fighting in those old felt shin pads. And, they liked the idea of that superhero look with the shin pads and the knee pads and the shoes,
the trunks.
Yeah. So that's where pancrase started. But the idea was to have real fights using pro wrestling. So it was open hand. And then it was kind of an agreement. You wouldn't strike on the ground. You would wrestle on the ground, though in some fights it was striking on the ground, especially if you pissed off one of the Japanese, they control you and hit you, or vice versa. That's what's happened to Alan Goes as well. Yeah, Alan Goes started striking him on the ground. Then he got his knee or his ankle torn out.
Alan Goes, he was wearing all that gear and...
it was like I was told
right.
Alan Goes, when he first fought, he fought Frank Shamrock. Yeah, right. Okay. People forget that. And Frank basically, like, he beat Frank up on the ground because he out-controlled him, but then Frank would always get into the leg locks, and Alan just put up with a lot. I think it tore his knee out, and it ruined his ankle. We had to carry him out. Like, we were at the corner, walk out of the ring, get up, do it. So then when he got to the corner, he just collapsed, and I don't think he was prepared for the adrenaline rush. But look, pancrase was real fighting, open hand, and obviously one of the big names back then was to get in Shamrock. So they got Shamrock. Bus Rutten became a big name, and it was like, doesn't matter what weight class you are, 30-minute round, and there was those rope escapes. So basically what they did, they tried to even it up, that you could do an 8 count, like a 10 count if you got knocked down. So if someone got hit and got knocked down, you could get a 10 count. But also, if you're getting near submitted, to give the striker a chance, if he grabbed the rope, what they called a rope escape, it was the equivalent of a 8 count. Yep. So that's how the judges would score the fights at the end. So that's why you had those rope escapes. Also, pancrase, they were very forward thinking. They looked at their business model. They said their talent is their fighters, their talent pool. They can't afford to have their talent pool, decimated by heel hooks. So what happened in the early days, guys were getting their legs broken. Like, they just put up the typical Yamato Damashi to the death. And there were so many guys out with broken legs, or dislocated knees. So pancrase was the first group that actually banned heel hooks. They found that it was too much damage. So they did it to preserve the number of talent they had, because some of their biggest stars went down the hill to knee surgery. So, I was with pancrase from, actually, we started in 93. One of my other guys fought in 93, and then I fought 94, 95, 96. And while I was over there, I became friends with the guys from Shooto. Now, where Shooto came from, one of the big names in pro wrestling was the guy that started Shooto. He used to wear the tiger mask. He was known as Tiger Mask.
And just for people listening, they are a rival organization at that point in time.
At that time, Shooto started purely, and what happened is he went to All Japan Wrestling and he said, "Listen, I want to do fighting, but I want to I have an amateur base and build it up." So he actually created an octagonal ring.
Yeah. So same mission, to have real fights, but on an amateur scale, effectively.
But they wore face masks, and they were there was more striking involved, and he had striking on the ground as well.
Right, okay.
So he was the first one that had close fist striking. So that was the start of Shooto, and they started amateur. So while I was fighting pro for pancrase, I befriended a reporter over there, and he introduced me to a mate of his, and I went and would visit the Shooto gyms training, and I'd get my ass handed to me by, they had good, I always remember, went there and there was a really good Sambo guy, and we had the Sambo jackets on. He just tossed me around and armbarred me, and stuff like that. So I enjoyed the Shooto side. Then they said, "Oh, look, do you have any amateurs that can come over here and compete?" So that kind of put me at odds with pancrase, because I could see, because I had a lot of lightweights, guys at 50, 60, and they couldn't fight in pancrase because there was no weight class. So I said, "Look, I'll only send my lightweights here." And then, pancrase didn't like that in the end. Said, "Look, we can't have you doing both. Make a choice." So I chose Shooto in 97. Prior to that, people like Anthony Lang, I took Anthony Lang over there. He fought in Shooto. Len Zaslavsky, the wrestler, which I think you remember, Len fought over there. A bunch of guys I took over there and fought in Shooto. And then I started fighting in 97. That's how I got started with Shooto. But the interesting thing was, Shooto was always been, they were really MMA. Pancrase was kind of modified because you wore the shin pads, knee pads, no clenched fist striking, though now pancrase is clenched fist. They've had to go with the times. Yeah. Shooto always had clenched fist. It was like, we're going to punch. We're going to really, try and knock each other out.
Yeah.
And the founder of Shooto, that was his goal, was to have a real mixed martial art. And he saw Brazil. He went and trained in Brazil and did whatever he did. And that's how Shooto got started. That's why it's so, and they became rivals in the end. But what's happened, Shooto maintained its amateur base, but it lost a lot of its, because I don't know why they didn't align with any of the UFC guys, where I think pancrase did. So they're probably about equal now. Where before pancrase was the biggest thing in Japan, and then Shooto became even bigger because they were bringing all the good Brazilians over and having Vale Tudo Japan Open and stuff like that. But now I don't think there's any, they're about the same.
So I guess because we're going back in time, now that would certainly be an issue, but there wasn't, I assume your pancrase fights are pro, but theoretically you're having amateur Shooto fights after that?
Not me. By the time I joined in I think the first pro fights they did was in end of 96.
Right, okay.
So I think Anthony fought then, and that was when they started, okay, now we're going pro. They built up amateur fights for about 3-4 years. I think they started in 92 before pancrase. I can't remember now. I've got to look it up. But they built a base, and they were clever because by building an amateur base, they built a bigger talent pool of fighters. Whereas pancrase was very much elite. You had tryouts once a year where people would come and try out to join the pancrase gym. And I've seen those. They were pretty brutal. And it's funny that the kids would have to be there all week doing that. In the middle of the night, kids would get up and sneak out and run away. Typical Japanese kind of stuff. And then, there were, I saw brutality, beatings. I saw kids get slapped and punched, and they just got a woman. I saw, it was that.
All that Antonio Inoki type stuff.
Yeah, it wasn't good, And the shooto guy, the founder, he can't be. There's classic video of him hitting a kid with a shin iron break.
Oh man,
they all came from that old school. They thought that's just the way to train people, which we know isn't. But
we know that now. There's a lot of years where that's
so
pretty common
basically,
stuff.
my career of fighting 94 to 2001, 94 to 96 pancrase, 97 to 2001 shooto. So not a big lot of fights because I spent as much time building my gym as I did fighting. So I only had 13 fights in the end. So it's a mixed record. It's lost more fights than I won or drew. So it was different. Yeah, my mentality was a bit different. I was fighting to, I wanted to see if the stuff I did worked, and I just thought, I've got to fight. Do you want to see what this is all about? Whereas my mentality now, if I had my now mentality, be okay, I'm going to fight to win and be the champ.
What was I going to ask you from there? Oh, because you had mentioned Shamrock. So we primarily, or at least we know them through their introduction in the UFC and sort of talking. Ken Shamrock was the first guy to come in who looked built as a mixed martial artist. Lion's Den was pretty legendary. You fought not only him, but Vernon White, who came out of that camp as well. What do you remember? Because you had already said, they wanted to bring Shamrock in. Where did he get this reputation so far back then? Before anyone, how did he become kind of known, and why was he wanted
when they were at the pro wrestling? They occasionally had real fights.
Okay.
So they would. I mean, there's a legendary fight, Roberto Duran.
What?
There was a look up
really
Roberto Duran fighting one of the old pro wrestlers there. It was
okay.
Well, remember Antonio Inoki fought Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, that was a terrible fight, though. I think it looked like he was trying to do jump kicks at his legs and stuff.
Yeah, he was right on the ground because he didn't want to stand. He knew he was going to get knocked out. But if you look at Roberto Duran, fought one of the guys who belted the crowd. And Roberto Duran, big fat belly, and is just working the body. So, there's classic fights. Maurice Smith, who was a world kickboxing champion. They were stupid enough to take him on, and and the funny thing is, I spoke to Maurice quite a lot, because I became good friends with him. Were you in the gym when Maurice came? Oh no, that was Maurice Smith. He did some seminars for him because he was coming to Australia all the time. He had some kids out here, but they would come and say, look, we want you to fight Mr. So-and-so, but look, could you just look after him and carry him? So you do that. And then sometimes they go, we want you to fight this guy. And he'd look at him and goes, and fight him. In other words,
Okay.
And you'd see some fights. If you look at those old, I forget what the show was called. Was it New Japan Wrestling or whatever? But Maurice Smith knocking him out, like sparking him or going the distance. And
so these are still under the pro wrestling banner at the time, hey?
They would either have a kickboxing fight or where it would be they would wear their pancrase short or their old pro wrestling gear and fight Maurice and get sparked, or it'd be a mixed fight, where generally, if it was a real fight and it was one of the good guys, they'd take Maurice down and tap him out real quick, they weren't stupid enough to stand up. With the Roberto Duran, I think you can see work the body. He was probably told, look, please, Mr. Duran, please make the fight good, So in other words, don't spark him. But, mate, look it up. You'll see it. It's amazing. Someone told me about it years ago, and I looked for it. Oh, holy shit! Roberto Duran fighting in All Japan Wrestling. It's just
So the Lions Den gets known through pro wrestling then originally,
I think,
and then
Shamrock was a big star in the pro wrestling, and he had a couple of these boxer versus wrestler fights, and he was known. He could really shoot. He could take these guys and he could hook them. So, and obviously they all trained together, and Shamrock was exceptional. He was one of the best guys there. So he would kill. He would just take out all the Japanese. He had a good wrestling background. So I think it was the old pro wrestling thing where you had your group of fighters, but you'd have one or two guys that could break everybody. So when they'd go, in pro wrestling, this guy gets the title, sometimes guys say, I want to keep the title. So, well, in that case, fight Shamrock. And Shamrock is going to beat you up. Okay, I'll give up the title.
Right.
So and Ken wanted to fight real as well, and that's why he went to pancrase. He had a couple of real fights. Thought no, it's just the pro wrestling was enough, and then he went to that. And I think Ken was well ahead of everybody back then. He had the technique, he actually knew how to hook guys, so he had the catch wrestling style. But obviously they didn't. He wasn't a crash hot striker back then. And then when pancrase brought in guys like Matt Hume, who had a really good Thai boxing coach there, and Matt had a good wrestling background as well. Yep. So they were a good addition to.
So Matt Hume was even around back then, hey? Because I remember him as sort of a referee from Pride, and obviously he's now coaching Demetrius Johnson. And
you had Jason DeLucia, you had Frank came in after Frank Juarez, but he changed his name to Shamrock. Obviously, you had Ken, you had Matt Hume, with Todd Bjornathan. They were fighting back then, and we there'd be guys floating in and out all the time. Big names that would have a fight. And Maurice Smith would fight regularly back then. Then Bus came in, and just extremely strong, and just what a guy, what a fighter.
Who do you kind of consider the original mixed martial artists who blended them together? And what I'm kind of asking about that is, like you mentioned Maurice Smith, and I kind of remember specifically the fight he had with Coleman, where he accepted the fact that he was going to get taken down and stomped on for 20 minutes, but then he's cross training with Frank Shamrock, and Frank Shamrock is arguably the guy who could do both equally well. What do you sort of remember about that period? And I guess, am I kind of in the right range of discussing either one of those guys as really the true mixed martial artists?
If you look at the prototype of the Adesanyas now, and the real good guys, you look at Bus and Maurice, because they were both competent strikers who learned how to grapple. So, whereas Shamrock was a fantastic catch wrestler and wrestler who had to learn how to strike, but unfortunately, that I think that's been his undoing. Having too many boxing fights and stuff like that. So, Frank was very good at the time. But if you look at who are the prototypes for the current champions and guys like Maurice and Bus. So. Yeah,
and it's funny because we're back to strikers, and I think it almost kind of starts maybe a decade ago with Junior Dos Santos, who then into Stipe and Adesanya, and it always used to be ground and pound, but now it's really about being able to strike and sprawl and brawl. Like it kind of comes back almost to just wrestle, box, and sprawl and brawl a lot of the time.
Yeah, look at the original pancration, like I said in the previous before. It's who was the best pancration fighter, the best boxer out of the wrestlers, and the best wrestler out of the boxers.
Yeah,
so you just got to out wrestle all the boxers, and you got to outbox all the wrestlers. So
we'll start talking about catch and that sort of thing now, because again, I wasn't like a lot of people of my age group. It was the introduction of BJJ into the UFC that kind of took the world by storm. Now, somewhere maybe around 5 years ago, I don't know if it was necessarily more people paying attention to Josh Barnett. I know it's come from Eric Paulson, but catch wrestling seems to be getting a lot of attention now, and we're training that as well. And you seem to be, it's there, but for like the past 20 years, it was, a far off 4th or 5th place to BJJ,
Absolutely.
Judo, and those sorts of. What do you think has kind of caused this, I guess, rebirth or recognition of catch after kind of being stuck, out in the wilderness for so long?
I think, definitely BJJ's held it back. It's just, I remember, like when I was doing BJJ, leg locks, that's a cheap way. That's a cheap way. You don't leg lock. It's just like you were told not to do certain things, like pressure points. Like, in catch wrestling, you've trained with me where you stick an elbow in somewhere and get a reaction.
Constantly. You just constantly seek that stuff out.
Yeah, and the way you get a grip and you're putting a wrist lock on as you're, like, I think that's the big thing now. Wrist locks are going to be the next big thing.
You reckon so? Yeah, right.
Man, more and more wrist locks, especially in BJJ. If you look at the problem with wrist locks, is they're so devastating, because as you're trying to take the pressure,
it's all torquing. With heel hooks and wrist locks, it's so much pressure on small joints effectively.
And the wrist lock is not like a leg lock where you can turn your body. The wrist lock is just isolating the wrist and bending it back this way or this way, and they just come on so fast. But in catch wrestling, you're constantly twisting and putting pressure on the wrist and manipulate. And for instance, when someone does a figure 4 grip, you're always told, I'll put 10 fingers, 5 fingers that side, whereas a catch wrestler won't catch that way. What do? He'll take the blade of the hand and twist it and bring it in. And, and that's catch wrestlers are just monster hands. They're just. I met Fujiwara Yoshitaki Fujiwara, and he's a huge guy. I didn't know how big he was, and when I shook his hand and I went to shake it, it felt like a paw that big.
Yeah,
It was just like, and just imagine this guy grabbing your wrist and just twisting it. And if you look at all these instructional videos, that's what he's like. And, grab your toes and twist. So he's starting at the little digits and then working up the joint. And I think that's the beauty of catch wrestling. It's so tight because it just takes up every bit of slack. And that was the advantage John Donoghue had. He had that fantastic BJJ background through the Machados, but then he was so fortunate that he was a Jean LaBelle black belt as well. So
was he really? Yeah, right. Yeah, okay.
So no, John Donoghue's like a mate. That's what I'm saying. One thing I did like about John is he had such a broad base. He'd wrestled with Rico Ciparelli. He trained with Hegan. He was one of Hegan's main training partner for years. He had trained with Jean LaBelle for heaps. So he had so many tools in his chest, and that kind of knowledge. And he was an impressive coach in that regards when it came. As a technical coach, I couldn't floor him.
Why don't we talk about him a little bit more for a second? Because I remember, so now between knowing you with the Roosters, I think, not that I'm a massive follower of league, but I watch it, and I think it was probably around 2006, 2007 that Grapple Tackle was really big, and I think he was working with the Storm at that point in time. Ant has told me he's working with the Tigers, so it seems that all these clubs have brought in grapplers.
Tigers, as in
Wes.
Who's working with them?
Ant said that he was doing some work with them. Parosh.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah. So because I think Concord is like 2 blocks away from his gym in 5 Dock. What I'm asking is, when do you remember sort of this kicking off? Because we even went on the footy show with Ant and Elvis to talk about this back in like 2006 or 7, and it was big news. Grapple Tackle was like the thing for like a year when it came to league.
Well, look, what happened was, Chris Aceman got the ball rolling. He was working with the Brisbane Broncos. And Craig Bellamy, the coach of Melbourne, was up there. And when he moved to Melbourne, he asked Chris, who do you know down here that can help us with a wrestle? And Chris Aceman recommended John Donoghue, knew John Donoghue. So they reached out and contacted John. Now, John's personality, if you've ever met John, he's a bit of a ruthless like he's quite evil when he applies things and stuff like that, maybe from his Jean LaBelle background. But Bellamy has a very similar trait, very ruthless. So they got on like a house on fire. And it was basically, I remember training with John back in 2002 or 3, and the Storm had come in. It was just brutal what he was doing to. So he actually started the Storm back then, and then they started improving. And what happens, a lot of the stuff they did, there weren't rules around it. So they were doing stuff which was probably contrary to the spirit of the game, as what they would say now, but there was no rule against it. There were guys that used to do similar stuff before, but they were just known as, just rough, dirty players. But then the whole team were applying cranks and,
like chin straps and
doing stuff like that, better handles and levers. And then everybody was blowing up about it. And, they were just controlling the ruck, which is when they're tackling and peeling off, and they were just doing it better than everybody, And then people tried to fight fire with fire, and then the league came in and changed the rules to stop certain things. And it's gone too far where now they're trying to stop it altogether, but you can't, because wrestling is intrinsic to rugby league. You tackle someone, you take them down. That's how you do it. There's no other way to do it. But with the Storm, with what John did back then, it was within the rules at the time, and then the rules had to change to stop that stuff. And then they adapted and they adopted stuff, and that's what's now. What a league get out of wrestling, and again, wrestling, it's not so much jiu-jitsu, is just being more efficient of taking people down, or getting back, or getting up to your feet to play the ball faster. That's what's really, really
so
good.
Scrambling, I guess, effectively.
Yeah, and unlike what people think, in league, once you take someone down, you can't adjust your position in your handle. So you can't go, I'm going to put my hand here. That's called a second effort, so you get penalised. Yeah. Basically, when you grab them, whatever handles you have standing, you got to take to the ground, and then you got to release and get up. So as soon as you start working them over, which would be reasonable in jiu-jitsu or wrestling, to adjust, then you can't do that.
So in a practical sense, do you want to tell me sort of what that means and how you might work that with the Roosters?
Well, no, what we do is you go back to proper tackling technique, or what they call hit stick wrestle. You know, you hit, nothing beats in rugby league, nothing beats impact. So if you don't have good contact to begin with, and if you don't or absorb the other person's energy, then you can't stick to them, you can't get handles, regardless of what you do. Once you get handles, then you have to work them down to the ground. Yeah, and that's quite complicated too, because the guy can spin, and it's not like you got jiu-jitsu uniforms to hold on to. That's where your wrestling comes in, understanding which handles to use, and then how you apply pressure on the ground. And again, it's not like jiu-jitsu or wrestling where you can sag your weight, because what you've got to do is you've got to have the ability to peel out and get to your feet quite fast.
Yes.
Move. So, as I said, as far as, is there any, you could look at it and say, oh, it kind of looks like wrestling. Yeah, you could say that. There's no, you're not going to see someone do a single leg. You're not going to see someone do a shoulder throw. You're not going to see someone do a suplex or a half suplex or hip toss. They're not part of wrestling. It's a wrestling tackle with some, it's a footy tackle with principles of pressure and control and stuff.
So do you think a lot of that has led to the new rules of 6 again, which has been a big change in the game?
Yeah, but when you look at most of the penalties, because like my role at the Roosters is not just as a technical coach, but we do a lot of analysis and we call stats and stuff like that. A lot of those repeat sets or 6 gains are for things that are not wrestling orientated. It could be not being, when they get up, not being right in front square, or it could be not peeling out fast enough, that stuff. But as far as the good initial contact, stick and takedown, very rarely do you get penalised for that. So yeah, I think what football teams really enjoy about any kind of wrestling training, it's the closest thing to match conditions. The heart rates get up high. The amount of strength and aerobic work matches the footy, because they've stuck heart rate monitors on the boys, and they have grommets. They have sensors in the back of the shirts where they can do deceleration forces in the back.
That's right. Yeah.
So they actually know what kind of pressures come in the game, and when they put those on during wrestle sessions, they find they almost match the game. So the coach and the sports scientist encourage more wrestling within the program to simulate those kind of conditions. As far as technique goes, I basically, some of the football principles I brought back into the gym, because I think they're quite good, but they're not many, but it's a lot of the what would you call ethical kind of principles of tackling, as opposed to
that's a pretty good segue when you talk about how wrestling lifts the heart rate almost to actual competition. We were talking about how now the UFC, a lot of the strikers are the top tier guys and the champions, but traditionally it's always been wrestlers. And we'll talk about sort of folk style and collegiate wrestling as well, which seems to be the dominant one. But why do you think it's been so hard traditionally for strikers to enter? What do you, I guess rather my question is oftentimes it seems that strikers are not willing to put in the time or don't have the mentality to learn grappling, effective grappling.
Okay, I think it's got to do more with energy systems. Like I have first-hand knowledge of that working with Pete Graham and other guys. And what happens is there's a certain energy system when you're striking, it's explosive, it's short burst. When you suddenly put a grapple in there and you've got that pressure and you're not breathing as well, and you've got to wrestle your way out, you lose a lot of that spring and explosiveness that you've had unless you specifically train that way. So I think guys like Adesanya and Whitaker, especially those guys, because they're machines, they're awesome. What they do really well now is probably the kind of training energy systems that they use, because they don't strike any differently to anybody and they don't grapple any differently to anybody. What they do is they're able to switch from ground to stand, back to ground, without losing tempo, without having to recover. Whereas you used to see in the early days, the strikers would get taken down once, maybe scramble to their feet, and then they just lost all the spring out.
And that was it, yeah. So, and can I ask you what that means when you say energy systems?
Okay, well, you've got, the three basic energies. You got your aerobic, which is long lasting. You got your ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Then you got your CP, creatinine phosphate. So, the sprint, 100-meter sprint is that first 10 seconds. You blow that out, you can't sprint again. Then you got an energy system which works for about 40, 50 seconds. And that's your creatinine phosphate. That's more middle distance kind of stuff. And then you got your endurance, long distance. So you're constantly training to go from that high speed, high intensity training and repeat that over and over again without dropping off in your speed and power. So, it's the kind of training guys do now with, whether you do a 40-second interval with a 20-second break, or whether you do a 30-second interval with a 15-second break. And the amount of load that you put on there, whether it's 30% of your maximum or 60%. So I think the science behind training in mixed martial arts is catching up to where it should be, like other sports. So the really good guys have got a team of guys, especially if you've got someone that can program and periodize. And that's one thing that I've learned. That's the thing I brought back from the football, understanding how to apply that science and that knowledge to fighters. So, and that's, I think, the step that the good fighters make. And obviously you've got some freaks, the guys that are just like, he just keeps coming and doesn't stop. And that's where we were going to talk about collegiate wrestlers. They had that because they scramble so well.
Let's break this up into a few parts here. So you kind of define it. Strikers just generally who move into this aren't prepared or aren't willing to kind of adapt to that, I guess is what you're saying.
It's uncomfortable. And I don't think it's because they've got to learn a new skill set. If you ask most strikers, and I know Peter found it at first, they get claustrophobic and it's like, they panic underneath because it's so foreign to them, and because this is a different way of breathing. One of the things you get out of football is you're getting three guys. You're getting maybe two guys, 200 kilos holding you down, and you've got to be able
and then
to
you reset and do it again
and get up and do something. And that's one thing people don't realize. It's different when it's a one-on-one and I'm holding you down, I'm adjusting. I'm never, you remember that old jiu-jitsu thing, the 100 kilos. They used to talk about holding someone down, the 100-kilo takedown or hold or something. There was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu thing, how to apply a lot of pressure and put weight on guys, and that's fine for jiu-jitsu wrestling because you've got the time. In football, you've got to do that in 5 seconds and get up. So what you do in football is you stack 2 or 3 guys on top and you create the same pressure. So you've got to imagine you're suddenly trying to freeze, you flatten out, and then you've got to get up and play the ball. And that's one thing footballers do. That's why they like the wrestling training, is because it gets them used to that uncomfortable or that not being able to breathe. And you teach them to breathe under pressure. Whereas most people under pressure hold their breath. And that's what I think happens to a lot of the strikers. They're used to striking their way out rather than holding and then creating space, wriggling and then breaking free. And it's a tough one.
Okay, so this is good. I think we're moving in the right place. So before we talk about collegiate and folk style and all that, what do you think? Because we're going right into the same part, which again, I got introduced to this doing BJJ and then working prior and with guys like you for MMA. I really enjoy the wrestling based MMA activities. What I've still found though, and we'll talk about sport jiu-jitsu as well and how that goes with it a second, a lot of the guys that now that I'm doing some teaching with them, I find it incredibly hard that if they start in BJJ to get the mindset of simply pulling guard versus forcing that scramble. And I guess we can talk about leg locking and sport BJJ after that, but I assume that you've had to deal with this. It's been a very, very hard struggle with me to create drills and try to put it through people that when you get taken down, it's not automatically pull guard. You have to, if you intend to fight, you got to figure out a way to try to not get on your back.
I think one of the best training sessions, when I first started going to the States, I trained with John Lewis at JSEC, so he's an early MMA guy.
I remember John Lewis,
John. And they used to do a drill, and he was a Pedinaris guy. So, Andre had come there. One of the simple drills they did is you start on your back, someone's on top, and you got 3 things. I think you might have done stand, sweep, or submit.
Yep.
So number one priority is get back to your feet. So how to scramble back to your feet. So they did that back then, which is really good. If you can't stand, then you try and reverse your sweep. If you can't sweep, only then do you go for a submission. You know what I mean? So the guys that just go for submission, that that don't try and sweep or stand basically spend a lot of time on the bottom getting beaten up. The guys that try and stand and create that, and then what happens is the guy that's trying to keep you down puts extra pressure on you, or he's got to adjust. Suddenly you might find a tipping point where you can sweep and reverse.
Yep. Or
you find that you've created enough space then to scramble back and get to your feet or snap him down. So simply doing a drill like stand, sweep, or submit is a fantastic entry to get people thinking differently in BJJ. That's probably a good drill. You're going to get guys that just simply lie on their back and try and submit. So, well, you're going to spend all night down there unless you try and stand up.
Yeah.
It's going to get pretty boring for you.
and then how do you think that's because there's multiple periods of BJJ now, and I feel like at my age, you're a few years older than me, with Dean Lister and John Danaher introducing this like fully encompassing leg locking game, the sport jiu-jitsu that I watch today, I find it very difficult to watch where they tap hands and they both drop to an open butt scoot guard and they attack legs.
Not for me.
and I wonder, because we've got guys like Gary Tonin in one, and I've had the conversation with other people. Do you think that we will see a modern day leg locker who can effectively transition that into MMA?
Oh, is there anybody that's fighting the top tier guys that's beating them with it?
I think you mentioned in the previous interview too, there was a guy named Ryan Hall who's been doing this effectively. Gary Tonin has been doing it very well, but it's effectively I don't want to say one trick pony, because again, if I was doing pure jiu-jitsu with these guys, they would just take the limbs completely off of me. Yeah. But who was it? It reminds me very much of like Imanari. It's like if you can identify the fact that he's going to roll and take out your legs and prevent that from happening, you've taken their game away from them effectively, I suppose.
Well, and then hopefully these guys are getting clever enough that they're going to fake going down and then come up with an uppercut or a knee, and which is fantastic if they do that. That's what was it. Junior Dos Santos did that with Mark Hunt. Who was it? He
wheel kicked him in the face, but I'm trying to remember what.
I remember when who was it that fought Mark that kept shooting him for the legs and then Mark back out, and then he go and then stand up, and then he went to shoot. Mark went down and kneed Mark straight in the face and knocked him out. It wasn't Junior. It was one of the Brazilians did it. It was just
that would have had to been when he was champion. What's his face? I'll come back to you. I know exactly who we're talking about.
Anyway, but maybe look, I don't think it's a
Verdun. That's who it is.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, yeah. So look, I think maybe the leg locking game. Look, they're building. The good thing for them is if they're doing it now and it's working for them, then what it's going to do is the next guy fighting going to go, shit, now I've got to change my style, which really you don't want to do. What you need to do is you need to adjust your style to account for that. But, if people now are more worried about the legs, then they're going to be more open to those maybe up kicks or a knee or something.
So they'll find a bridge to make that effective.
Well, I think the leg lockers, hopefully, those guys that are using them are also going, well, how am I going to use this to open up an opportunity for a strike? Though I honestly believe it's frustrating to see world-class wrestlers fighting in MMA who are beating everybody up, collar tying, dirty boxing, then suddenly trying to box guys and getting knocked out. So why would you change your style?
Yeah. And we see that a lot. Yeah.
It's just they knock someone out. They think, oh, this is great. Now I can just knock people out.
Yeah. So let's talk about that for a second then, because a lot of people are confused by it. And I was confused by it too, because even though I grew up in Canada, I wasn't a high school wrestler. And a lot of people don't understand sort of catch, Greco-Roman, freestyle. So collegiate wrestling is the program that most American kids go to high school with to learn how to wrestle. And the dominant form of wrestling is folk style wrestling, which is really the kind that translates to MMA because there's a lot of ground control. And typically, once they finish high school, if they wish to continue to develop or continue to wrestle, they begin to specialize in either Greco-Roman or freestyle. And catch is fingerprinted all around these elements, but catch is wrestling with the submission. So these are diluted forms of wrestling without the submissions. If I broadly, am I describing that correctly?
That's correct. Because if you look at where folk style came from, it came from the original kind of catch can, which is what catch stands for. Catch is catch can.
Right.
So that's what it stands for. And absolutely, that's the predominant style came from Germany originally. My understanding is
Hackenschmidt, isn't that? Or?
Yeah. So it came from there, and then there was places in England that were really good at it. Came to the States. It's interesting, in the States they have that. Is it called the junior US Junior Nationals in Fargo?
Yeah.
It's a junior or school age. Yeah. So the kids go there, and it's an 8-day competition, 4 days of freestyle, 4 days of Greco-Roman, and these kids that a lot already do they do folk style and stuff, go to this and then try their hand at freestyle or Greco, and you got 5,000 odd wrestlers, 23 mats. I've been there 3 times refereeing, so I've seen it quite often. That's just an amazing place. But in the US, I think they've got like over 5 million registered wrestlers.
Yeah,
more
right.
people than play sport in Australia. That's just an amazing number of people wrestling. So the great thing about catch and folk style is, unlike the Olympic style, where if you slip or you fall and you land on the ground, you go to your belly, you kind of stay there, and then the guy tries to tip you over, and if you can't, you get called up. So you're actually giving up your back. Ideally not to, though they're getting better at scrambling. Whereas folk style or collegiate style reward you for not giving up your back, or if you do go down, is getting back up and escape points, which that's why it's such a strong style, and that's why the good folk stylers or collegiate stylers made the best transition to MMA rather than the Olympic style guys.
And do you think it's fairly safe to say, because in the early days of MMA, it was all freestyle wrestling. If you remember, it was double legs, double legs, double legs, double legs. And as you sort of get older, you can't do that anymore. What I found is I'm finding it much easier to teach my guys Greco-Roman wrestling, where we don't have to be so dynamic, where you just go, if you can just get some grips on them, you got a chance.
Range is different now. You're fighting if you look at all the good guys now. Gone are the days where you stalk guys like Akiro in the early days when he came around. I don't know if you did the seminar that we had, and he made a really good point. For some reason, the UFC back then in the octagon had a octagon in lines printed inside the cage.
Yeah,
and sorry, on the mat.
So you knew how far away you were from the cage at any point in time.
That was perfect for him, because he knew as soon as he got someone back to that line, that was the perfect opportunity to shoot. And because he was pressuring and getting close enough, he would be able to shoot at that point, bounce him off the cage.
Off the cage, yeah.
So that was one of his big skills, and the drills that we did with him. They were brilliant drills. And then, but what's happened now is people are better at evading that range. And you've got the Adesanyas, and the body type has definitely changed. Longer, lankier guys, which
African body type, effectively almost,
crazy. Thank God I never fought with like that. And then, but you're going to have some specialist takedown guys. But the reason why Khabib was so good is, if you look at, you can go to the internet and look at Chechen scrambles, Chechen wrestler scrambles. They scramble better than any other wrestler.
Yeah, right. Okay, so that's something to Google, is it? YouTube?
Yeah, look for those Chechen scrambles or mad Russian scrambles, and you'll find most of the wrestlers are Dagestani or Chechen or whatever. They were doing that kind of collegiate, folk style scrambling. They've been doing that for years, because it's their mountain style or whatever it is. So, with now, I think you got, like you said, Greco is the way to go, because you've got to get in close enough to engage and shoot or grapple from them and work more upper body takedowns. And then if you can get him up against the cage, it used to be that you press him up against the cage, drop your level, take the legs. You don't see much of that anymore, because guys are really good at staying off the cage.
Yeah, well, it's just so much easier than constant level changes, especially, as you get older and your knees start to go and you realize that you can't squat 200 pounds or anything like that anymore. Randy Couture. I know that you consider yourself good friends with him. What I think is very funny is I still have a Couture instructional from probably like 2005 or something that talks about all these Greco clinch work. And you're in it at the end of the thing. I think he's got some behind the scenes footage of training in Japan or something. There's a clip of you right at the end of it.
It was when he fought Ensign Inoue.
Yeah.
And he lost, which was a big shock.
That was the arm bar, I think, from the bottom.
Yeah. And because there was, basically, I was just lucky. Japan invited me out to commentate, to do the English commentary.
Oh, really? Yeah, right.
Yeah, so if you ever hear me doing a little bit of commentary and stuff, but it's in Japanese and then some stuff. And I was lucky. I had Coleman, So there was Mark Coleman, Randy, oh God, what's his name? The big heavyweight. I'll think of his name, not from Ohio. So yeah, there was all these great guys there, and then I managed to train with all of them, and it was fantastic. It was an opportunity to kind of, and that's how I got to know Randy a lot better, through that trip.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it was, yeah.
Well, we've been going for a while, so we'll start to wind down because I'm sure you got other things to do besides talk to me all day. But as I mentioned, I sort of moved. I began to have the opportunity to start doing coaching, maybe roughly around 3 years ago. And as I mentioned, I was listening to you on the other podcast. It's a new phase, and there is a transition between thinking or lying to yourself that you still have the ability to compete with some of these guys versus moving into a coaching role. And it was kind of interesting as saying, like, look, your role has changed now. You're not really there to be a sparring partner for these guys anymore. You were there to help them learn and train them. I'll ask you to talk a little bit about that. And then also, as you mentioned, creating systems. So almost like best practice for some of these guys to turn them into, or at least, helping them meet their goals.
The best piece of advice I can give to anybody that's an ex-athlete, especially males more than females, we're testosterone driven. Most fighters are alpha males. You want to prove yourself. It's very hard to finish fighting and not continue to be competitive. And I find a lot of guys make that mistake. And I still see coaches, and I've had coaches in my gym that were like that. And I gave him this advice that I got from another really good senior coach. He said, if you compete with your students and you beat them up and humiliate them, which, because you're showing them that you still got it, they will hate you for it. They just despise you, and they're just like, he's a bully, whatever. If you really have a go compete and they beat you and they know you were trying hard to beat them, they won't respect you anymore.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And that's true. That's what happens. I go, oh, geez, he's always trying to show himself, blah, blah, blah. And I've seen that firsthand with people. Fortunately, I've never been like that. I've always tried to teach people, always had a passion for coaching. So as a coach, very, very hard not to compete, and just be very wary of who you do that. Now, I'm very honest with guys. I said, look, I'll give you 2 rounds. That's all I've got. I'm going to be after that. I just today did a training session. Boys, I'm going to go hard on you to stand up so you feel what it's like with a Greco guy. We did some upper body wrestling. I roughed him up and said, that's it. That's it for me. I said, I don't have anything beyond that, boy. So, now we'll go through it. But I was very honest with him. I said, look, if I had to spar anybody, for real or something like that, no, it's just too old now to do that. So your job as a coach, there are those 4 stages. When you get the new guy, it's do as a coach. I tell him what to do. He just does what I do. No discussion. Look, just do this. Make sure you do it that way. Then he gets to the stage where we can discuss it, but he still does what I tell him because I know what's best for him. Then the next stage, when he gets good enough, it's just like we discuss it together. And I say, well, you choose. What do you want to do today? What do you want to work on? You know what you want to work on, and I help him. And then, the really good guys come in and say, look, I've been sparring and doing, we've got a problem here. And again, as a coach, I know that I'm very stale now for the last, especially with lockdowns and everything else in my businesses. Probably I haven't developed myself any personal development since probably about 2016.
Yeah. Really?
Prior to that,
right.
I was constantly traveling. I was fortunate to be traveling with Pete, and I was going to the States, training at some of the best gyms with the best people, and upgrading my skill level. And I think that's one thing as a coach. You can sit back and say, oh, I was a champ, I was really good, and I got this black belt. But unless you're constantly upgrading, going and training with other people, going to other gyms and looking, you're going to stay stuck where you are, and your students are going to exceed you. So as a coach, it doesn't mean you've got to compete more, but you definitely got to keep that mind ticking over. And again, where I've excelled as a coach, I might have stopped a little bit with my technical stuff, which I hope to get back to, but where I'm really good, I've been fortunate with my job with a professional football team. I have better understanding of planning and volumes and loads and how to get guys to a level faster through scientific training principles and learning how to coach better. So that's the other thing. Personal development could be from technical stuff, because you always got to go and like you look online. The other day I saw a body triangle escape, and it looked identical what I did, except for one little point that he made about hooking the knee with an arm and doing it. I thought, great, that's another point. Yeah, so we've got to look at that as coaches. Now, yeah, we're going to get some guys come to us that are really, really good. That's the other thing too, is you're going to get these talented guys who you think, man, this kid's going to be a champion, and then they don't stick with it. And then you get the guys, and you got to know, the guys are going to stick with it. So one of the things is a great book called Curse of Talent, where you get these talented individuals. Oh, you're going to be a champ, mate. You're the best. You're kicking it. That's the wrong attitude. What it's got to be, mate, with hard work and that ability that you've got. If you keep working hard and you try and improve yourself, you're going to get somewhere. But it's going to take hard work. These talented guys never have to work hard, and then when it does get hard, they back off. And I see that all the time.
I was going to ask you about that specific, because fighting in martial arts is a little bit different to any form of team sport. Because if you join a team sport, you're going to be having practices and games all season. So even if you only do it for 2 or 3 seasons, you can say that you're seasoned in that. But it takes up so long to fundamentally build up a fighter. As a coach, I assume, I assume it's got to be mentally taxing when you see how much time you've invested in someone, for them to just kind of give it up after a couple of fights, where you go, man, we put like 4 years into you, and all of a sudden you just decided that, no, I don't want to do this anymore.
It's going to happen. I don't think you can't be bitter. Like when I was a younger coach, and I had one particular fighter who's extremely talented, like Ian Schaefer.
Yeah,
I got him started in MMA, and he was just amazing. His reflexes, and I can't take credit for that because he trained with Mick Spinks, and Mick Spinks got that, and I helped him with his MMA side, the transition side, so I can take a bit of credit for that. But I had him lined up for fights with Shooto, but he went another way with some other BJJ guy that said, "Oh, come with me," blah blah blah. So I was a bit shitty about that myself, and as a coach, but I just let it go. That was his path. Whereas if I sat there, whereas I saw Ian, I think last year, someone at a show, hugs and braces. I love the kid still. He's a good kid, but mate, that was his choice. And I did my job as a human being, as a coach, up to that point. If he felt he had to go somewhere else, that's great. What I can't let that do is for me to not coach guys. You know what I mean? I have one of my good fighters now, and he brings fighters from other gyms all the time in to train with, and other gyms probably wouldn't let that, but I said, mate, if this is helping you, great, bring him in. So, and then I'm helping those guys as well. So,
all right, last one I got for you. In the other interview you did, I found this hilarious to find out. You ended up training with Chuck Liddell without even knowing who he was.
Yeah, that was fun. Again, a J-Set, and I've got the picture with it. And I remember they said, "Oh, this guy's got a fight coming up. Can you work with him in the cage?" And my job was to press him up against the cage and try and keep him pinned there. And he was bang, big guy, off. And then it was, I thought, shit, this guy hit me. He's really good. But we had a really good, solid training session, and we got some photos afterwards. And then when I looked at the photo, it was he was a bit beefier back then. It was a young Chuck Liddell. It was quite funny, because he didn't have the shaved head where you could see the tattoo on there. So I've got this picture of me and him there. I go, "Oh, my training partner at JSEC," and it was Chuck. It was just like, look, he probably wouldn't remember me, but it's so funny that happened. But look, I've trained with heaps of guys, like when Rico Rodriguez, before he was any, like they used to at the Machado.
That's who I was wondering if you said when you were talking about UFC heavyweights, you said the big guy. I was going, I wonder if
it was, and they used to call him Fat Rico. It's just like he was a big chubby guy back then, and mate, he's awesome. I remember training him, and then he tried to heel hook me, and I had my pancrase days, and he tried to knee bar me, and John says, "I wouldn't do that, Rico." And I started tweaking. He's not these days, tear me in half, but he's it was so funny. But look, I was fortunate at the time that I trained. Like I said, I trained with everybody and not really knowing who they were at the time or how big they would become. Like that, the pancrase really was the early days, and created some friendships or some associations with people, which have helped me develop, in the future. So.
Larry, I appreciate your time. I think we've been going for about an hour and a half, so I think that'll probably do enough. As I said, it's been almost a decade since I've spoken to you, so I hope it's not another decade before I have the chance to speak with you again. But I hope you come out of lockdown all right, and I hope things begin to pick up.
Yeah. Well, look, the one thing I want to move into, again, I'm still doing technical, but is more development of coaches, which I think is there's a big thing for, like I said, I've had this fortunate thing where I've learned a lot from football, and I can bring a lot of that skill and expertise to all combat sports, which is quite lacking, except maybe in the ones that are right up at the Olympic arena where there's funding and money for it. But I think that's the next step for the MMA guys. The techniques there and the quality technical coaches are there, but I don't think there's enough people that know how to develop, the physiology and, the stuff like diet is a big thing too, I think as soon as athletes and coaches embrace that part of training, then we're going to see a lot more guys like Whitaker and Volkanovski come out of Australia.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I'll ask you about this. As I said, I've been teaching for a few years. I got a private gym set up at my own house. And if you want to check out Larry, it's Boxingworks. It's very easy to find online and send him an inquiry. And I really appreciate your time, Larry. It's so good to kind of go through these periods. And as I said, just fill in these knowledge gaps of kind of what was going on at this point in time. And I appreciate it because I never really got the chance to ask. You finish a training session, you go, I'm exhausted, I'm going home.
Look, not many people are interested anyway, so it's nice for someone to take.
There's a few of us around that still enjoy this. So
young guys are too busy doing other stuff now.
Fair enough. Well, all the best until we speak again.
Thanks, buddy. Take care.
Cool. Awesome.